All right, I will say good morning. To begin by thanking our sponsors, I thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves, Dovi, and Nina Elman for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month in honor of their daughter Ayelet becoming a bas mitzvah. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, Ayelet will continue to be an incredible source of nachos for her mishpacha in the years to come. So we'll say today's daf is Daf Lamed Zayin 37, and we are picking up B'mirat Hashem on Lamed Vav Amud Beis. So we left off literally last line on 36b. The Gemara says as follows: Tana Rabbanan, Ein Ofen Pas Ava B'Yom. You can't go ahead and bake thick bread on Pesach. I should say Pesach. So the Gemara says, Divrei Beis Shammai. These are the words of Beis Shammai. Top of Lamed Zayin. Beis Hillel matir. And Beis Hillel says it is permitted. V'kama pasava. How thick is thick bread? So Bepashtos, we're assuming now that the issue that the Gemara is discussing is one of if the dough itself is too thick, there could be a concern that there may be unbaked pockets, and unbaked pockets, of course, could potentially lead to an issue of chametz. That's what we're assuming for now. So Machlok is Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai says you can't bake thick bread. Beis Hillel says you can bake thick bread. V'kama pasava. By the way, how thick is thick bread? Rav Huna tefach. Rav Huna says a tefach. Suppose I remember again, so we know that a tefach is about 3 inches. So that's not an insignificant loaf of bread, thickness of a loaf. So you can't bake a loaf. That's a tefach. Shekin matzinu b'lechem aponim tefach. And we'll say, so where do they grab the shear? Where does that come from, the shear of a tefach? Because we find by the lechem aponim, the bread of the Beis Hamikdash, that the bread of the Beis Hamikdash was a tefach thick. So the Gemara says, so therefore we'll say, if you take a look at Rashi says over shekin matzino v'lechem aponim, shu aser lavo chametz kedarminan b'menachos, kol hamincha shetakrivu l'rabos lechem aponim lechimutz la'azhara. Va'afilu hachi, Ove dafnosav dahainu lachem shayulupanim bein panim bechusim etevach. So we'll say, remember, so what Rashi's pointing out over here is the lechem apanim was not chametz. Lechem apanim was not chametz. So lechem was not chametz, but lechem apanim was also 1 tefach thick, or at least really the size that you're supposed to remember. Again, we know the lechem apanim, remember from our menachos days, the lechem apanim was not just like a stam loaf. It had an interesting shape, almost like a U. So the thick parts of it were a tefach. So from here you see, Beis Hillel says that you can make a loaf of bread that is a tefach and thickness without it becoming chametz. But any more than a tefach, you run the risk of allowing it to become chametz. So Maskef Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says, come on, you can't go ahead and bring a raya from lechem apanim. I'll tell you why. Im Amrubi's reason, your B'Sheino's reason. So first of all, lechem apanim is made by Kohanim. And as we established in yesterday's daf, Kohanim's reasoning, there's a certain element of zrizos. And even if you want to say that it's not by Kohanim, but it's in the Beis HaMikdash, there's a makom of zrizos. So first of all, number one is being dealt with by zrizin in a place of zrizin. But again, it happens to be over here that halacha l'maisa, the lechem apanim is made by Kohanim. So you have an exceptionally alacritous group of individuals who are overseeing the production of this bread. So if you're going to say that you can make a loaf of a tefach by zrizin, yomru b'she'ino's using, you're going to say with people who are just regular stam people who might not be as zaris, im amru b'pas amela, yomru b'pas she'ina amela. Furthermore, if you're going to say that you can make a loaf up to a tefach without it becoming chametz, that's because Rabbi say the lechem aponim is pas amela. Now, pas amela means literally it's worked dough. Rabbi say means, again, Rashi points out over here that there was this incredible halacha by lechem aponim that you literally had to knead it and to beat it a series of times. Now, Rabbi say this happens to be one of the most important halachas in Hilchos Chametz that very often is forgotten. We often assume that a dough becomes chametz if you have flour and water and remains together for 18 minutes. So that's incorrect. A dough only becomes chametz if it remains together for 18 minutes and is unworked. is unmanipulated, meaning dough only becomes chametz when no one is actively kneading the dough. Technically speaking, if you're kneading a dough for 3 hours, it does not become chametz. So therefore, the Gemara says over here by lechem apanim is what it was pas amila. Pas amila means the dough was constantly being kneaded. So because of that, that also prevented the chimotz process. Yomer b'hashe in amila. Rabbi say if you try to go ahead and make a dough. If you try to make a dough, that's ultimately, again, that is a tefach thick, but it's not amila, it's not constantly needed. Of course, it'll become chametz. Amru be'etzim yeveshim. Furthermore, in the Beis HaMikdash, they only used dried wood, which means firewood that was very well dried out. Rashi says, etzim yeveshim shayu mavin osa mi'imos hachama kidarmina betainis michamisha sarba'a ve'ilech tashash kocho shel chama. Supposed to say this is very interesting. So in the Beis HaMikdash, they would stop gathering firewood as of Tu B'Av. Tu B'Av. Because after Tu B'Av, the strength of the sun begins to weaken and the wood doesn't burn as well. So in the Beis HaMikdash, they only used dried out firewood, which produced, again, a greater intensity of flame. Yomru be'etzim lochim, but outside of the Beis HaMikdash, people use moist wood. Moist wood, the fire doesn't burn as intensely, and therefore halacha l'maisa, you have a greater concern of chimutz. Im amru b'tanur cham, yomru b'tanur tzonein. Furthermore, in the Beis HaMikdash, the oven was already hot. Was always hot. It was always hot. Outside of the Beis HaMikdash, it takes the oven a little bit more time to heat. Well, as a general, when a person's turning their oven on and off, it takes the oven time to heat up. So say all the Gemara is pointing out over here is as follows. You're making it sound like, remember again, this is Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef is saying, you're making it sound like that it's no problem to create a loaf that is a tefach thick, but yet not chametz. All Rav Yosef is coming along to say is, it's not so pashut. The reason in the Beis HaMikdash they were able to do this was because they had all of these different ingredients, quote unquote, in place. In place, that's what prevented a loaf that is a tefach thick from becoming chametz. But if you try this at home, your loaf is going to become chametz. Ib amru b'tanur shamatachas, yomru b'tanur shacharis. In the Beis HaMikdash, they had a steel oven. They had a steel oven. Again, metal conducts heat in a certain way. You can't necessarily reproduce those same results in a home earthenware oven. So the Gemara says, therefore, Rav Yosef therefore says to Beis Hillel, don't take it as a davar pashut that just because in the Beis HaMikdash they made a loaf that was a tefach thick and not chametz, that you too could produce those same results outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Says the Gemara, Amr Yirmiyah bar Abba, She'iles es Rebbe biyichod umani Rav. So Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba said, one time I asked my Rebbe when the two of us were alone, who was his Rebbe? It was Rav. Ikadarmi, others say, Amr Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amr Rav She'iles es Rebbe biyichod uman Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Others say that I asked my Rebbe in private, and who was it? It was Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yudah Nasi. My pas ava. What is this meaning of thick bread? Remember again, this whole brisa began with a discussion of Machlokes Beis and Beis Hillel about baking thick bread on Pesach. So I asked my Rebbe one time, what's thick bread? And my Rebbe answered, pas meruba. Thick bread actually doesn't mean thick bread. Rather, thick bread actually means a lot of bread. Pas meruba, it means cooking a lot, or baking a lot of bread in the oven at once. Rashi says over here, pas meruba, harbe chararin biyachad, v'lav mishum chimotz naketlei, u'bechararin dakin kambar, mishum dekatarech tircha dehulo tzarech. So we'll say, listen to this. What was the discussion of Shammai Beis Hillel? They will say they're not talking about chametz loaves. They're talking about very small loaves, which ultimately, again, could remain non-chametz. So what was the shaila? The shaila is, can you cook a lot of bread in an oven at once, even if you don't need all of that bread on Yom Tiv? So I will say, this is a Hilchos Yom Tiv question, not a Hilchos Pesach question. We know that on Yom Tiv, one is permitted to engage in Ochel Nefesh, food preparatory activities. Am I permitted to go ahead and bake more bread than I need for Yom Tov. That's the Shaila. So the Gemara says, so my karile pas ava. So ultimately, again, so why do they call pas meruba pas ava? In other words, if you really mean a lot of bread and you don't mean thick bread, why are you calling it thick bread? Mishum dinafisha belisha. Because I will say what they used to do is when you were making many loaves, you wouldn't necessarily create a different batter, for each loaf, but rather, again, you'd make one huge batter, and you'd separate out pieces of that and make each individual piece into its own loaf. The other possibility is that first wide line, in that particular locale, for this time, they call pas meruba pas ava, fine, my time. And so we'll say, so what's the issue? What's the issue with making a lot of bread on Yom Tov? So we'll say, so it's very simple. The halacha of Ochel Nefesh says you can go ahead and you can make what you need for Yom Tov. But we'll say, let's say again, I need 2 loaves over Yom Tov, and now I want to fill up the oven with 10 loaves. That's what's called tircha yisera. That's called unnecessary exertion. And halacha l'maaseh, again, that should be prohibited on Yom Tov itself. If that's the case, my irya b'Pesach, afilu b'Yom Tov nami. If that's the case, then why is this a shaila being asked by Pesach? In other words, it's a shaila by any Yom Tov. In other words, we got thrown a little bit because the Brisa said, "Ein ofen pas ava b'Pesach." So I don't understand if this is a Hilchos Yom Tov question, and I will say it's a good kasha. This is a kasha, by the way, that comes up a lot of times on Yom Tov, as we'll see in just a moment. Namely, halacha l'maisa, can I bake more bread than I need on Yom Tov? But if it's a Yom Tov shaila, why are you framing it on Pesach? To which the Gemara says, Inachinami, V'haitana b'Yom Tov shel Pesach koi. So I'll say, says the Gemara says, you're right, they didn't need to frame it by Pesach, I could have framed it by Yom Tov, but the Tana happened to be dealing with this question on Pesach. So when the Brisa asks about, can you do this on Pesach, you're right, it's not because it's a Hilchos Chametz question, it's a Hilchos Yom Tov question, but it was asked on the Yom Tov of Pesach. So the Gemara says, that supports us. Beis Shammai omrim in ofen pas ava b'Yom Tov. Beis Shammai says you can't go ahead and cook, or I should say bake, thick bread, which we're defining as more bread than you need on Yom Tov. Or Beis Hillel matirin. Beis Hillel says you are permitted to do so. So I will say, this happens to be a very interesting discussion. Let's go with what everybody agrees. Everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa on Yom Tov, the license for Ochel Nefesh, allows you to cook what you need on Yom Tov and no more. If that's the case, then if I only need 2 loaves of bread, how does Beis Hillel allow me to cook an oven full of bread? Sirabo say there is a concept in halacha that there are certain items which, if they are cooked in greater quantity, go ahead and enhance the quality of everything being made. One of those examples is bread. It must have been with the way that they produced bread or they baked bread, but lamaisa, if I needed 2 loaves of bread, Eina dome cooking or baking 2 loaves in an empty oven versus baking 2 loaves in a full oven. Because remember again, the way they used to bake their bread was they would take a dough, they would stick it against the side. So apparently, the less airspace there was in an oven, the better the quality of loaves. Beis Hillel holds that halacha l'maisa, you are allowed to bake more loaves on Yom Tov, even though you don't need them. Why? Because the baking of the additional loaves will improve the quality of the loaves that you need. So we'll say in halacha, this is called ribui bashiurin, which is that once you're permitted to go ahead and cook something on Yom Tov, you are permitted to go ahead and add on additional units, even though you don't need them, if those additional units will improve the quality of the food item you are going to use on Yom Tov. So for example, we'll say, a good example of this is I think it's a good example of it, is like chicken soup. So if you're making chicken soup, so it's just, maybe it's just 2 people. There's just 2 people. So how much chicken do 2 people need in a chicken soup? 2 pieces of chicken? But everyone knows that the more chicken you put in the chicken soup, the more flavorful the soup. So you want to put in 10 pieces of chicken into the chicken soup. I know one's going to eat that. No one's going to eat it. It doesn't matter, because since it's being placed in order to go ahead and enhance the taste quality of that which you are going to eat, even though it turns out that you're actually cooking much more chicken than you're going to consume, it becomes permitted. And that's how we paskin halacha l'maisa. So both I say, interestingly enough, what began as a conversation, we thought about making a loaf that's a tefach thick for Pesach, in fact, has nothing to do with hilchos chametz and everything to do with hilchos yamtiv. Good. Tanra Rabbanon. So we'll say back to chametz. Tanra Rabbanon. Yotzin bepas nikia ubehadra ubesrikin amitzion bepesach. So we'll say. So now, interestingly enough, other types of items, of matzah items that could be made on Pesach. Yotzin. Now, yotzin, we're generally assuming that the items mentioned here could be used for matzah. Pasnikia. So we'll say pasnikia means literally matzah made out of fine flour. Hadra. Again, we'll discuss what hadra means. Srikin hamitsuyarin. So srikin hamitsuyarin, we'll say, means wafers with a design. Srikin is a wafer. Mitzuyar means with some type of design on top of it. Bepesach. Even though ideally we don't like you making wafers with an image on it, right? We'll say we're going to see in general, which makes sense. Why don't we want you making images with wafers with an image on it? Like we'll say matzah with an image on it. Why not? Because we assume images take time, and in general, when it comes to the baking of matzah, we don't want you taking time, right? We want you to get the job done so as to avoid any potential chimutz issues. Therefore, ideally, we don't like you using wafers with any type of images. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Davar zeh sha'al baitos benzonim lechachamim. Baitos benzonin, his name is Baitos. He asked the chachamim this question. Why can't we go ahead and we make wafers with a design? How nice would it be, right? To take out your matzah and to have a little design on each matzah, different design on each matzah. Why not? What's the problem with doing this? Amrulo, they said to Baitos, because what's going to happen? A woman's going to be designing her designed wafer. She's going to end up taking too much time designing the design, and it's going to become chametz. So Baitos says, "Come on, Amar lahem efshar yasena b'defus v'ikva nekivon." So Baitos says, "No, that you think that's how we make designs?" He says, "I have a press. Press is the wrong word. I have what is it? Stamp. Thank you. I have a stamp. You think we fashion this by hand? You take a stamp, you put it in the dough, and ultimately, again, ta-da, you have your image. It takes 3 seconds. There's no additional time. So let's listen to this. Amru lo. So they said to Baitos, Yomru kol asrikin asurin usrike Baitos mutarin. Do you think the halacha should say that all designs are asar except for the designs of Baitos which are mutar? Then I will say this phrase. You've seen this phrase many times. This becomes a popular refrain throughout Shas. Whenever the Gemara wants to say the application of halacha has to be uniform. It's not just like I'm saying any legal system. Any legal system always has exceptions to the rule, but the exceptions have to be few and far between. At the end of the day, the law has to apply uniformly in order for it to have any level of peace. And this is whenever the Gemara wants to suggest, the halacha shouldn't apply over here, it should apply over here. So the Gemara says, Yomru kol asrikin asurin, srike baitos mutarin. So now when you see that phrase, this is where it comes from. So Baitos says, but my design should be okay, right? My designs are okay. My designs are just made with a stamp. It's 1.3 seconds. It doesn't add on anything to the chimutz process. So Chazal said, shkoyach on your stamp. Very nice. Should we say that all stamps are asur? Your stamp is mutar? Amar Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, Pam achas nechnasti l'achar abba lebeis Rabbi Gamliel. Supposed to listen to this. Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok says, one time I followed my father into the house of Rabbi Gamliel. Ve'aviu lefanov srikin hamitzuyarim bepesach, and they brought in front of him these wafers, which was a wafer's just a matzah, right? A wafer with a design on it. Amarti Abba lo kach amru chachamim Ein osin strikin Yom Pesach. So I said to my father. So remember, we'll say this is Rabbi Lazar. This is Rabbi Lazar saying to this is Rabbi Lazar Bat Shadik saying to his father. Isn't the halacha that you don't make these wafers with designs on Pesach? Amar li bini lo shel kol adam amru ela shel nachtumim amru. So this is very interesting. So Rabbi Tzaddik then told his son that when Chazal said you can't eat wafers with a design, that's only baker's designs. Baker's designs. Why? Because apparently, I will say, first of all, apparently most bakers did not have a stamp like Baitus, and most bakers, when they made their designs, were very meticulous with the designs. Which then there was the concern that what? That because they're pashking along with the designs, it's going to take time, it's going to become chametz. However, I'm sorry. I just lost the place. Amr li bini lo shakal adam amru ela shenachtumu amru. So he said to me, my son, Chazal only answered the designs made by bakers. But here in Rabbi Gamliel's house, this wasn't designs made by bakers, it was just designs made by regular people. They're not so makbid, they don't spend so much time, and therefore there's no concern of chimutz. Ikidam, an alternate version, hachi kamar lo shel nachtumin amru ela shakal adam. But saying an alternate version is just the reverse. That bakers' designs you don't have to worry about. Why? Bakers are proficient. So because they're proficient, whether it's with a stamp or whether it's by hand, they get it done quickly. But regular people take a lot more time. Ultimately, again, in making these designs, and therefore it's problematic. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yossi said, Osin srikin kimin rikikin. You can go ahead and make srikin like rikikin, so also which means you could go ahead and make matzahs that are like wafers. Ve'ein osin srikin kimin gluskos, but you cannot go ahead and make these wafers that are like gluskos. Gluskos means like thicker cakes. So both say. So first of all, the Shulchan Aruch Paskins, we don't make srikin. We don't go ahead and make what the Gemara calls srikin and mitzuyarin. We do not make anything with the design on it for Pesach, right? Or I should say, we don't make matzahs with the design on it for Pesach, out of concern that halacha l'maisa, too much time spent on the design ultimately could lead the item to become chametz. What if I have the stamp? Shabbos says, remember the famous line, Yomru kol asrikin asurin, srike baitos mutarin. Even if you have a stamp, you can't do it. And Shabbos say, once you begin to see over here, this kimin glusko, Shabbos say, is also part of the bigger discussion regarding thicker matzahs. So again, you begin to see that Chazal are saying, even if you have a way of somehow impeding the chimutz process, we don't want you making anything thicker for matzah, because Rabbi say the concern always is with anything thick is having pockets of potentially unbaked dough. That's where there is a concern. Remember again, Rabbi say even in thinner matzahs, there are those who have the custom, the minhag of gibraks, of not eating gibraks, which again, the whole issue of gibraks is a concern of an unbaked pocket of matzah, an unbaked pocket of dough, that if it comes in contact with liquid, still has the ability ultimately to become chametz. If you see that was a concern according to some, even with the thin matzahs we have, all the more so with thicker matzahs. Tana. We'll say some more examples. Hasufganin, v'haduvshanin, v'iskaritin, v'chal. So let's define our terms. We'll say, so sufganin, interestingly enough, is like a sponge matzah. That actually sounds pretty good, right? Right? A sponge matzah, right? Like more like a spongy, like a sponge cake, sponge bread type of matzah. Duvshanin, Rashi points out over here, is a type of matzah that is fried in honey. The iskaritin, Rashi says iskaritin is a wafer. Chalas hamasares. So we're going to see also chalas hamasares is also a type of fried bread. Vahameduma. And meduma, so we'll say meduma, Rashi says over here, it's a totally different example, is chulin shenafla truma l'sochan. Meduma is a mixture of chulin and truma. So we'll say, we're transitioning over here for just a moment from the halachos of matzah, ultimately again to the halachos of challah. Or as we'll say, we're asking now, what constitutes bread from which you have to go ahead and separate challah. Now, the truth is, they're very much sister concepts, because as we're going to see, in order for an item to be treated as matzah during the year, it would have to go ahead and satisfy the criteria of lechem. If it's not lechem, I know that sounds strange, but you understand what I mean. Leaving aside the chimutz piece, but ultimately, again, in order for something to go ahead and be usable for matzah, it would have to satisfy the halachic category of lechem as well. So that's why the Gemara we're going to see kind of going back and forth between some of the halachos of taking challah. Remember again, both said halach of taking challah, you're making a dough, you have to go ahead and remove a portion of it and give it to the kohen. That halacha only applies when you're making bread. It does not apply if you're making cake. Well, sometimes the line between bread and cake is not always easily discernible. So the Gemara is going to go through a little bit of a sugi now, which is really very interesting, about what's bread, what's lechem, what's not lechem. So you have a bunch of examples of this. And all of these examples that the Gemara just brought, the sufgan and the dufshan and the skarit and the chalas hamasares and the meduma, pitur min challah. All these cases, these items are pater from challah. So the Gemara says, by the way, my chalas hamasares, what's chalas hamasares? What is that? This is what the balabatim call scalded bread. Scalded bread. So we'll see in a little bit greater depth exactly what it is. Amar Reish Lakish, halalu ma'aseh ilfasein. So Reish Lakish says, all of these items mentioned, these are myself as well. Say ilfas is a frying pan. So Reish Lakish indicates to us that the reason these breads are going to be pater from challah is because at the end of the day, the only type of bread that is chayiv in challah is one that is baked in an oven. Any bread that is made in a pan, that is made in a frying pan, halacha l'maisa, is not subject to halachas of challah. Rabbi Yochanan says, maisa ilfas chayav. And Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. He says, no, a bread that is made in a frying pan could still ultimately again be chayiv in challah. So why were the aforementioned items pater from challah? Sha'asan b'chama. Interestingly enough, they're baked in the sun. They're baked in the sun. So because they're baked in the sun, therefore halacha l'maisa, they're not subject to challah. So it says the Gemara meisvei hasov ganon v'haduv shonon v'askaritin asan be'elfos chayavin. So we'll say we learned in a brayso. So all of the aforementioned items, the sponge, the sponge bread, the bread that is fried in honey, iskaritin, the wafers, asan be'elfos. If you made it in a frying pan, chayavin. Ultimately, it's chayiv in challah. Bechama peturin. But if you made it in the sun, ultimately it's pater. Tiyofta dereb Shimon Lakish. Rabbi said this refutes the view of Reish Lakish. Amar ula amar Reb Shimon Lakish. Hachamay askinon. What's the case? Sheher siach ula basov hidbik. We'll say what's the case? The case is where you fired up the pan and then only afterwards attach the dough. Aval hidbik ula basov her siach mai. But we'll say if you went ahead and you first attached the dough and then fired up the pan, what would be the halacha? Hachanami dipturin. Then Abba Sidi Patis. So Reish Lakish is suggesting you're right. It depends how you utilize the frying pan. If you put the dough in and then fire it up, that's like frying, and halacha l'maisa, you're going to be pater from challah. But if you preheat the pan, that resembles more like baking in an oven, and halacha l'maisa, you be chayiv in challah. If that's the case, adatani seifa asan b'chama pturin. If that's the case, then when the end of the brayso speaks about that if you made it in the sun, you're pater, forget about the sun. Liflog v'lisnei bididei. Why don't you make a natural distinction in pan frying? When do we say that ultimately if an item is prepared in a pan, in a frying pan, it can still be chayiv in challah? That's when you preheated the pan and then stuck the dough in it, because that more resembles baking in an oven. Aval hidbik ulubasov siach. But if you went ahead and you stuck the dough in there, and then only afterwards you heated up the pan, piturin. Ultimately, again, it should be pater from challah. To which the Gemara says, you're right. In reality, the brayso says is missing a piece, and here is how it should be read. When is this so? Shir siach ulubasov hidbik. We'll say, when is what so? When is it so that even if you prepare a bread in a frying pan, that is going to be chayiv ultimately in challah? That's if halacha l'maisa the pan was preheated and then the dough was stuck on. Aval hidbik ulubasof here siach. But if halacha lamaisa, the dough was first applied there, and then only afterwards was the pan heated up. Nasa kamisha asan bechama upeturin. It's as if the dough was made in the sun, and ultimately, again, you will be pater from challah. So we'll say we're going to see these halachas. This is a siman in Yardea that goes through again which types of we'll say. I'll just point out. There's interestingly enough, there's one interesting determinant. Well, let's see first. Tashma. We're not finished. Tashma. Yotzin b'matzahina. So we'll say this is what I mentioned to you before. Where the Gemara is gonna fluidly transition back and forth between matzah and challah. Now, what I mean by that is between the halachas of matzah and Pesach and the obligation to take challah throughout the year. And again, remember, we can make that seamless transition back and forth because the halachos are very much connected. You only take challah from what? From what? From pas, from bread. From something that halachically is defined as bread. And you can only use matzah from something that is what? Pas, that is halachically defined, quote unquote, as bread. You understand? Not literal bread. In other words, minus the chimutz. So the Gemara says, Tashma, yotzin b'matzah hina, or b'matzah asuya be'ilfas. You can fulfill your obligation on Pesach with matzah hina, and matzah that was made in a frying pan. I will say, what's hina? Look at Rashi. Eina afuya kol tzarcha. So I will say, interestingly enough, it means a non-fully cooked matzah. A non-fully baked matzah. So we'll say, if you have a non-fully baked matzah, halacha l'maisa, you could still go ahead and use that for Pesach. So we'll say, remember, how could that happen? See, it doesn't happen by us anymore. The reason it doesn't happen by us anymore is because we eat very thin matzahs. At least Ashkenazim today still eat very thin matzahs. So we'll say, if you ever look how matzahs work, they preheat the oven to an incredible heat. So pretty much those matzahs go in, and a few seconds later it's done. But if you could imagine, either if you didn't have an oven as hot, or if you had a thicker matzah, you could put the matzah in there. The outside could get burnt, but the inside could still be a little bit, what's the word? Chewy or moist, right? So the idea of the Gemara says over here, you're still yotze with matzah hina. With matzah hina, or matzah made in a frying pan. Rashi says, "Va'af agav de lechem, bo yinon kidichsiv lechem oni." So we'll say, okay, we'll come back to the frying pan. So the Gemara says, listen to this. So the Gemara says, "Bilfis hachana." So we'll say, so you see, before you get to the matzah hina, what do you see? You see from here that you can make matzah in a frying pan, and it works. So we'll say, now what I want to point out, by the way, is how are you making matzah? You see, when I say frying pan, you automatically think of, okay, or not, oil, right? We'll say, so I just want to point out, we're actually not using oil over here. I want to just point this out for just a moment, right? Because I will say, when you're talking about oil, cooking with a liquid medium is automatically called bishul, right? And once we're talking about bishul, so bishul already is a different kind of thing. So when they say using a frying pan, what they're really just talking about is using heated up metal, as opposed to placing something to bake in an oven. So the point the Gemara is making over here is you see that you could use a matzah made in a frying pan. So what's going on over here? So we'll say we begin to see this over and over. Yeah, you could use a frying pan. How can you use a frying pan? If you preheat it. If you preheat it, and then you stick on the dough, then essentially your frying pan is kind of functioning as an oven. Under those circumstances, it's usable for the production of matzah. Fine. My matzina. By the way, what's matzahina? Amr Yehuda, Amr Shmuel, kol sheparsa, vein chutin nishach ne'mena. What's an interesting definition? What's the definition of matzahina? It's any matzah where if you break it apart, it breaks apart cleanly. There are no strands of dough. So it might be a little bit more chewy, or it might be a little bit more moist, but it makes a clean break when you break it. Masha Inkain, if you were to go ahead and break apart your matzah, it would be a good matzah commercial, right? You break apart the matzah, right, and the matzah comes apart, but the strands of dough are there. That would not be usable for matzah. So the Gemara says, "V'chin lachmi toda." Rava says, "V'chin lachmi toda." The halach is the same thing by lachmi toda. I will say. So the toda loaves the total loaves, halacha lemaisa, if you have loaves, which were really wafers, right? If you have loaves that ultimately, again, essentially are baked on the inside, but moister on the inside, but still when you break the loaves apart, it's a clean break and there are no strands. There are no strands. Those are kosher for toda as well. So the Gemara says, pshita, that's obvious. Pshita, hacham lechem ksiv, v'hacha lechem ksiv. Both sides, it says lechem in both places. Says both, right? So therefore, again, just like lechem by matzah, it could be baked on the outside, even if it's a little bit more moist on the inside, as long as there are no strands when you break it apart. So too by lachmei toda. To which the Gemara says, Ma'od tema, what would you have thought? Ho'elu ksiv v'hikriv mimenu amadeis echad mikol karban. You might have thought echad shelo yital paras. So we'll say you might have thought that the echad means ultimately again that the loaves by the told have to be miyuchad, have to be totally complete. V'hacha kiman de prisa damya, and ultimately again, therefore maybe by told the echad teaches me that the loaf must be fully baked. Therefore again, the Gemara says kamash malan that that's not the case. Kamash malan that halacha lemaisa, even if the loaf is not fully baked, as long as the outside is baked, and when you break it, it's a clean break. Halacha lemaisa, it's usable for toda and for matzah. So meisvei, we raise a kasha, hameisa. We'll say, what about hameisa? Beisham, we'll see what that means in just a moment. Hameisa, beishamai potrin, ubeisila mechaybin. So we'll say, so this meisa, beishamai says yepater, Beis Hillel says it's challah. We'll say we're back now to challah. So Meisa Beis Shammai says it's pater from challah. Beis Hillel says it's chayiv in challah. So the Gemara says, what about hachlita? What about chalita? What about that? Beis Shammai chayiv and Beis Hillel potrin. Beis Shammai says it's chayiv in challah. Beis Hillel says it's pater. So Ezehu hameisa ve'ezehu hachalita. So we'll say, what's meisa, what's chalita? So the Gemara says, meisa kemach she'al gabe muglashin, or muglashin. So meisa, the Gemara says, is when you go ahead and you pour flour over boiling water. So meisa is flour over boiling water. So in the case of the meisa, Beis Shammai says it's pater from challah. Beis Hillel says it's chayiv in challah. Hachlita mugloshin al gabe kemach, as opposed to chalita, which is pouring the boiling water on top of the flour. So we'll say, see, interestingly enough, it's the same thing. In other words, it's scalded flour. That's how you're making the bread. But the difference is in the process, right? The meisa, ultimately, again, I'm pouring the flour on top of the boiling water, and chalita is I'm pouring the boiling water on top of the flour. So this is the machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. So it says the Gemara, Rabbi Shari Yossi Amrishum Aviv Zev Zeh Liftar. Rabbi Shari Yossi says in both cases, both meisa and chaluta and meisa and chalita are both pater from challah. They're not considered to be regular bread. So the Gemara says, Va'amri la zev zeh l'chiyuv. Others say no, both ultimately again will be chayiv in challah. V'chacham the chum say echad zeh ve'echad zeh. So the chum say it depends. Both of them asan be'ilfas pater. If you went ahead and you made it in a frying pan, it's going to be pater from challah. B'tanor chayiv. But if you made it in an oven, you're going to be chayiv. V'tanakamo. Maishna Hamisa, Maishna Chalita. According to the Tanakamo, wherein lies the distinction between Meisa and Chalita? I understand the actual distinction, right? That Meisa ultimately again is pouring the flour on top of the scalding water, and Liisa, and Chalita is vice versa, is the opposite. But what exactly is the halachic difference? In reality, there's a machlokes in both cases. V'tavra misha shana zu lo shana zu. And obviously, again, whoever taught the first brisa did not teach the second one. Katani mihas ve'chachamim omrim echad zeh ve'echad zeh shason be'olfas pater V'tanor chayib. Rabbi say, either way, we come to the end of this discussion. The Chachamim say, whether mi'isa or li'ita, at the end of the day, if you went and you made it in a frying pan, you're going to be pater from challah. If you made it in a tanner, it'll be chayiv in challah. Tiyufta de Rabbi Yochanan. This would seem to refute the position of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan will say, Rabbi Yochanan, Tanaihi. Rabbi Yochanan will say that in reality, it is a machlokes tanoim. The sanyo, Yochol yehe mi'isa v'chaluta chayav b'chala. You might have thought that mi'isa and chaluta should be chayav in chala. Talmud lomar lechem. Therefore, Rabbi said the Torah says lechem. Rabbi Huda Omer ein lechem ela afoy b'tanor. And the definition of lechem by definition is something that is baked inside of an oven. Rabbi Huda, I knew Tanakama, but Rabbi Huda is saying the same thing as the Tanakama. Elalav maise ilfas ikabinahu. Rather, Rabbi said the point of contention of the nafkamina between their two opinions must be the use of a frying pan. Tanakama savar maise ilfas chayavin. Tanakama holds that halacha lamaise, again, the use of a frying pan ultimately again makes you chayiv in challah. Rabbi Huda savar maise ilfas p'turin, and Rabbi Huda holds that the use of a frying pan ultimately again exempts you from challah. To which the Gemara says, lo, tuchuli alma maise ilfas p'turin. Everyone will agree that the use of a frying pan ultimately exempts one from challah. V'hacha kigon shechazer v'afa b'tanar. We'll say, what's the case over here? The case over here is where halacha lamaisa, you made something in the frying pan, but then you subsequently baked it off. We'll say, there's actually an interesting shaila in halacha. You made it in a frying pan, and you went ahead and you baked it off. Kamiflagi, the Tanakama savar, kevan shechazer v'afa b'tanar lechem karina bei. Tanakama holds that since you subsequently baked it off in an oven, therefore it's called lechem. Rabbi Huda savar ein lechem ela afoy b'tanar meikara. And Rabbi Huda says, no, the definition of lechem is something which is baked in the oven from the beginning. V'chevan de meikara lav b'tanor afye, as since you did not make this item in the oven from the beginning, lav lechamhu. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, it is not considered to be lechem. Very interesting. So we'll say, so first of all, you begin to see a number of different things here. So obviously the theme that keeps coming up over and over again is manner of cooking. Right? Remember again, that seems to be the great point of contention over here. Halacha l'maisa is something made in an oven versus something made, obviously everybody agrees if it's made in an oven, ultimately again it's going to go ahead and have the status of lechem. The shaila is if something is made in a frying pan. So we'll say, so just in the world of frying pans, here's what we've seen so far. We've seen halacha l'maisa. We've seen halacha l'maisa that maybe there's a distinction between preheating the pan, right, and then putting the dough in versus heating up the pan once the dough is already inside of it. Now we've seen another distinction about an item that is initially prepared in the pan, but then subsequently baked off in an oven. Does that have an impact on anything or not? So we'll see still. Amar Rava, my time Rabbi Huda, Dechsiv. So we'll say, what's Rabbi Huda's logic? The Rabbi Huda holds that halacha l'maisa, the definition of lechem is that it's baked in an oven. If it's not baked in an oven, it doesn't matter. It might look like lechem, taste like lechem, feel like lechem, but if it's not baked in an oven, it's not lechem. So where does Rabbi Huda get this from? So we'll say, interestingly enough, v'afu eser noshim lachmechem betanur echad. So we'll say, interestingly enough, it's from the Tochecha, right? Which is very interesting. What does the pasuk say? Literally, 10 women will bake bread in one oven. One oven. So we'll say, leaving aside the actual content of the pasuk, the point over here is that when the Torah tries to describe extreme poverty, right, as is expressed ultimately in the Tochecha, the Torah describes it as multiple women using the same oven. So you see from here that by definition, bread to be lechem, you must be baked in an oven. Ha'afoy b'taner karoi lechem, v'she'in afoy b'taner echad ein karoi lechem. Ultimately, again, that which is baked in an oven is called bread, but that which is not baked in an oven, ultimately, again, is not called bread. So we'll say, it's interesting. I just want to point out one thing that the Gemara here is not yet discussing, which in Mirz Hashem will come up, although this is not really the primary sugi of challah, is the interesting discussion regarding batter. batter, what the halacha calls belila ava versus belila raka, a thicker batter versus a more liquidy batter. That also has an impact. We'll see again. Hopefully, we're going to get to some of the halacha in Yeridea, but we'll see that also potentially has an impact about whether or not something is called bread and therefore subject to challah. We'll discuss. Yosef Rabba v'Rav Yosef achari Rabbi Zera. So we'll say Rabba and Rav Yosef sat behind Rabbi Zera. Yosef Rabbi Zera kamei Ula, and Rabbi Zera was sitting in front of Ula. Amar luhu Rabba Rabbi Zera. So Rabbi said to Rabbi Zera, "Boy mineni Ula, can you ask Ula the following shaila? Hidbik mi bifnim v'hersiach mi bachutz mahu." Supposed to listen to this interesting case. What happens? Hidbik mi bifnim. Supposed to say we're back to our frying pan. What happens if you put a piece of dough inside of the frying pan, and you lit the fire outside of the frying pan? I will say, now what's the image? What's the image here? It's just a regular use of a frying pan. I will say, how do you normally use a frying pan? You put an item in the interior of the pan, and the fire is on the quote-unquote exterior of the pan. So that's the case. I have a dough, I put a dough on the interior of the pan, I light a fire on the exterior of the pan. Mahu, what is the status of that dough that is made in the pan? Is that called bread or not? Amr lahu. Amr leh. So we'll say, so ultimately again, so Rabbi Zera said back to, so Rabbi Zera said back to Rabbi Amr leh, my amaleh. What do you want me to ask Ula? Diaminaleh, because if I ask Ula this, Amr li, hi nihu maise ilfas. Ula's going to say to me, what kind of kasha is that? That's frying. That's use of a frying pan. In other words, how else do you use a frying pan? You put an item inside of the pan, you light the fire outside of the pan, and ultimately, again, that's how you cook. So if I ask Ula that, he's going to tell me, no, that's not lechem. That's called maise ilfas. That's called the product of a frying pan. Rabbi Yosef said Rabbi Zera, fine. But we'll say this, the image is right here. Rabbi Zera is the one who's sitting right in front of Ula. So either out of deference or out of fear, no one else wants to ask their shilas to Ula. So the same time, Rabbi Zera, ask this. So they tell him to ask the first shilah. Rabbi Zera is not asking that. So fine, Rabbi Yosef says Rabbi Zera, boy mi name Ula, hidbik mi bifnim, va'avuka knegdo mahu. Oh, ask him the following shilah. What happens if you put a dough inside of the frying pan, but instead of putting the fire underneath the pan, you put the fire over the pan? Over the pan. So we'll say, so what does that mean? You put the fire over the pan? So we'll say, if you can imagine, essentially, instead of using it as a frying pan, it essentially is what? You're converting it into what? Into like a broiler pan. Right? That's essentially what it is. The fire is on top, the pan is underneath. So what's the halacha if you go ahead and you make bread like that? Mahu. Amrale, so again Rabbi Zera said, my emale. What should I ask Ula? Di aminale, if I ask him this, he's going to see, Amrali, rov aniyim osin came. This is how the majority of poor people, in fact, bake their bread. This is how the majority of poor people prepare. So if you look at Rashi says, rov aniyim osin, kol maise ilfas kain, she'in lahem eitzim, ubekachu memar lefo. So we'll say, interestingly enough, apparently broiling in general is considered to be the most expeditious form of cooking, because what you could do is you could achieve at least external results. Even if the inside is not fully cooked, it allows you essentially to sear whatever it is that you are preparing. So that's a normal way of cooking. So therefore, Allah Lamaisa, again, Rabbi Zera was reticent to go ahead and ask Ula about the status of these things, because since this is the normal. So the first way he wasn't going to ask because that's just normal use of a frying pan. The second way he wasn't going to ask because halacha l'maisa, that's the way rov aniyim prepare. And ultimately, again, that would be a normative form of afiyah, of baking as well. So we'll stop over here. We'll Meretz Hashem pick up with the sugya of challah and matzah and Meretz Hashem tomorrow. Shkach and